Hey guys, welcome back to the Hybrid Athlete channel. I am Dr. Paul Rimmer, and today I'm here to do some quick fire question answers. And again, a lot of these quick fire questions, at some point I'll probably do a little sports science short. So if you haven't checked out those videos, go and give those a watch. So today's question is, should I use fasting for weight loss as an athlete? Okay, I'm going to try and summarize this up really quickly. Okay, fasting causes weight loss because basically it creates a restricted eating window, regardless of what approach you try, whether it's alternate day fasting or 5-2 or the 16-8 sort of lean gains approach as well. One thing I would definitely not advise if you're going to use fasting to lose weight is to use an alternate day fasting or a 5-2 approach. Why? Simple. It's going to impact on your recovery. In order to support muscle growth, muscle repair, recovery, even if you're not a strength athlete, you're an endurance athlete, you need to be providing your body with amino acids and enough energy on a day-to-day basis. If we train on a Monday and we fast on a Tuesday, for example, doesn't matter. Our body's repair and recovery processes are going to have those demands that next day. So if you are going to use an approach, what I would say is use a sort of 16-8 approach. So that would be a 16-hour fasting window overnight and an 8-hour eating window. Now, what I'm going to caveat that with is this. Some people might say that encourages metabolic flexibility because you can switch to more fat storage and glycogen, between fat and glycogen usage and carbohydrate usage more easily and efficiently. There might be some truth in that. However, there's other ways in which we can do that as well, where we don't need to be in a fasted state, particularly for athletes who want to train earlier of a morning. Even if you don't want to have like a big meal there, what I would suggest is a protein modified fast, which isn't really a fast at all. So that means that maybe we wake up in the morning, we take on some protein, maybe take on some protein of a morning, and then we do our training session. So we've still got some protein in there in order to support our recovery, especially if we've got a long period of fasting before our next meal. By the way, fasting isn't some magical mystical thing. There's a lot of nonsense around there in terms of things like longevity and stuff. This is like animal models, mouse models, yeast, things like that. I'm not talking about that from any other context in terms of lifespan or health, but most of those things in terms of improving metabolic function are also associated with fat loss. So dietary approach and fat loss always comes down to this idea of energy balance and creating a negative energy balance. Fasting is just one way of doing that. But like I said, if we are going to fast because we find that quick and easy and convenient, we still have to adhere to those rules. We still have to create a calorie deficit. A lot of female athletes I work with sometimes struggle with that because if they've got an 8-hour eating window and let's say their maintenance calories is 2,000 calories a day, if they're still not careful with food choices, they can still end up overeating and then not losing weight or even gaining weight, because following a fasting approach does not just give us carte blanche to eat what we want whenever we want. Well, especially not whenever we want, but what we want. So we still need to have an awareness of what calories that we're taking on board. Like I've said, if we're training early in the morning and we've got a long fast before we open our eating window, I would still use a protein modified fast. Some people would say that's not fasting. I'm inclined to agree, but it's just a way of thinking about it. What about endurance athletes or athletes who've got an early morning training session? What if we're worried about carbohydrates? Well, as long as the day before we've eaten enough adequate carbohydrates, if we've been asleep, for example, we've got our endurance session the next morning, chances are we're not going to have depleted any muscle glycogen. So we're not going to have depleted those carbohydrate stores in the body. Well, why? Well, because we've been asleep. We've been oxidizing mostly body fat whilst we're asleep. Those reserves are going to be left fairly untouched as well. So I wouldn't worry about necessarily having to take on carbs before a morning session, but I would say taking on protein is probably very important, particularly for athletes, particularly with athletes with a really high training demand. Again, if we're doing that though, what's the point of fasting? Some people will argue about that metabolic flexibility aspect of things, switching between carbs and fats. If that's something that you're trying to get from fasting, you can do that in what's called a train low approach. So you could simply get up and do what I've done there, which is to train low carb. Get up, maybe have a carbohydrate depleting or glycogen depleting workout the night before. So say on a Monday night, you do a hard session, don't refuel that evening, wake up in the morning, you still have your protein, maybe some fats, and then that next session there, you're still doing that in a carbohydrate depleted, glycogen depleted state, which is then going to potentially elicit some of those adaptations that you will get from harder, high intensity interval training sessions, because you're creating a metabolic stress by training in that low glycogen state. There is some evidence to suggest that's effective. There's some evidence to suggest that it promotes pathways such as PGC1 alpha, which will stimulate endurance adaptations. And there's also some evidence to suggest that part of the reason that it does that is by maybe sparing glycogen and switching on our fatty acid machinery, if you will. What I would say is that's very small percentages that we're potentially gaining, probably less than small percentages. So it's not the primary thing to worry about. My philosophy has always been, before you start playing with these fancy strategies, let's focus on fuel and performance. Fuel and performance doesn't necessarily mean we have to have a big carbohydrate rich breakfast if we've got a long endurance session of a morning or a strength session, particularly if we've consumed adequate carbohydrates the night before. Think of it like your car. It's on the drive. You fill up the petrol tank the night before. Your car's still going to be full of petrol, right? You don't need to put any more in. It's going to overfill. So a light breakfast then would do the job. So in summary, fasting is an approach that can be used for fat loss, which can be useful for athletes, but we have to be aware that it might impact on recovery, it might impact on fueling. So therefore, if we are going to use a fasting approach, choose a 16-8 fasting approach or something similar to that, 16-hour fast with an 8-hour eating window. And if we are going to train earlier in the morning, perhaps think about taking on board particularly strength sessions or sessions that are going to be glycogen depleting or muscle breakdowning that are going to encourage muscle breakdown. Take on some protein either before and that post-workout recovery window. At the end of the day, that might not make that much difference. Total daily protein amounts are going to be more important than the timing of them, but I would just encourage for athletes who've got particularly long endurance-based rides first thing in the morning, or particularly high intensity, CrossFit style sessions, lots of volume, lots of muscle breaking down, please put some protein in there and it will definitely help boost that recovery. Hopefully that helped, guys. Peace.